Initiating central control, preparing for pawn structure development and potential queen sortie. Developing the knight towards the center immediately stakes a claim and prepares for further pawn breaks. Securing central space and preparing rapid piece development, this advance boldly stakes white's claim. Solidifying the kingside structure, black prepares to develop their bishop and reinforce the center with a flexible pawn chain. Developing the knight solidifies central influence and prepares further piece activity, putting gentle pressure on black's potential queenside expansion. Instantly pinning the knight sets up a tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the center pawn structure while opening a diagonal for the queen is a sensible, quiet development, preparing for a king's Indian attack setup. Unlocking the queenside with b6 now prepares a fianchetto for the bishop, aiming to challenge white's central control and exploit the queenside space. Aids in central pawn control while potentially preparing for a kingside knight maneuver, though it relinquishes quick development of the kingside. Developing the bishop to influence the d4 pawn now adds significant diagonal pressure. Shifting the knight to g3 aims to exploit the bishop's current diagonal on a6, potentially leading to a kingside attack or offering a retreat for the knight if needed, while preparing to castle kingside with increased safety. Trading off the bishop for a knight here liberates black's pawn structure and opens a diagonal for the queen, potentially leading to quicker development and creating active play against white's somewhat cramped kingside. Creating an isolated doubled pawn offers white a dynamic structure, potentially opening lines for attack, but it also weakens the queenside and grants black a potential target for future pressure. Challenging white's central pawn structure, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and bishop on the a6-f1 diagonal, while simultaneously creating dynamic counterplay in the center. Unleashing the queen to f3 immediately contests the d5 pawn and prepares to support a potential kingside attack, a bold stance against black's central pawn push. Initiating kingside safety is paramount, securely tucking your monarch away from the central skirmishes that are beginning to brew. Unleashing a central pawn storm now aims to pry open the position and exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's pieces, potentially disrupting their development and creating attacking opportunities on the weakened kingside. Opening up the d-file suddenly forces white to consider their central pawn structure and the potential vulnerabilities it creates. Unleashing the knight into the center, this aggressive thrust immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the king. It's a bold statement, seeking to dictate play and disrupt black's development before they can consolidate their position. Unlocking the center, this capture exchanges a knight for a bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces, creating dynamism. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately reestablishes central control, sharpening the focus on black's king and the pawn structure black has created. Centering the queen on d7 is a nuanced maneuver, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially connect the rooks, while also keeping a watchful eye on white's central pawn push. Asserting influence on the c5 square, this maneuver by the bishop signals an intention to dominate the long diagonal and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the initiative, black reroutes the rook from its now cramped e-file to the open d-file, potentially challenging white's queen and setting the stage for pawn structure adjustments with the upcoming c-pawn advance. Sharpening the bishop's reach towards the kingside, this maneuver initiates a subtle but potent central pressure that black must carefully consider, potentially forcing a concession in pawn structure or piece activity as the queenside assets are drawn into the fray. This maneuver injects immediate tension, challenging white's central pawn structure and potentially opening lines for black's rooks. Capturing the rook offers a clear material advantage, but it opens up unexpected tactical possibilities for black along the newly cleared dark squares. Watch for black's potential queenside counterplay and ensure your king's safety is paramount. Developing the knight to c6 immediately addresses the pawn hanging on c7 and simultaneously prepares to contest the central files, a crucial step after sacrificing the rook. Securing the queen's dominance by forcing the exchange now clears a path to potentially attack black's exposed king and capitalize on the open lines created. With the queen now off the board, the battle shifts towards a decisive material advantage for white. Black must now urgently mobilize their remaining pieces to resist the looming pawn advances and potential rook infiltration. Securing the castled king against any immediate threats, this maneuver prioritizes kingside safety, a crucial step now that the queens are off the board and the tactical storm has subsided, preparing for a more positional struggle where pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the flow of the game. Black's knight, after finding itself misplaced on d7 and then e8, now ventures towards the queenside, aiming to exploit the open a file and perhaps pressure white's vulnerable pawns. This maneuver, while seemingly aggressive, carries a hidden risk of becoming a target if white can consolidate their king and launch a counterattack. The question remains whether this piece infiltration will lead to a material advantage or simply leave black's position with significant weaknesses. The central tension now firmly resolves onto the queenside as white introduces a fresh piece to the ranks of the open e file, a critical artery for potential future operations. This maneuver signals a strategic shift, aiming to bolster the rook's influence and prepare for a more active presence in the endgame, potentially pressuring black's weakened pawn structure. Reclaiming the attacked bishop on c4 immediately addresses the tactical oversight that gifted white the queen, aiming to stabilize the position and reduce the material deficit, albeit at the cost of further pawn concessions. The bishop retreats, clearing the d-file for its rook and now eyeing that precarious knight on a5. Emerging from the tactical flurry, black's knight now solidifies its presence on a strong central square, threatening to disrupt white's newly unified pawn structure and potentially unlock dormant attacking avenues. Shifting the bishop to this central diagonal prepares for a potential kingside pawn push, aiming to exploit the slightly less coordinated nature of black's pieces on that flank after the exchange of rooks and subsequent king safety concerns. Black aims to immediately challenge white's centralized piece and open lines for his own active pieces. The pawn push to c5 creates an immediate tension in the center, potentially forcing a reaction from white that could grant black more breathing room or even lead to an exchange that benefits black's development. This is a proactive move, seeking to disrupt white's solid structure and create dynamic play rather than passively waiting for white to improve. Unlocking the d-file and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure simultaneously, this capture aims to simplify the position while potentially creating connected passed pawns down the line. Reclaiming the central pawn allows black to solidify their queenside pawn structure, potentially transforming a temporary material gain for white into a lasting positional weakness by creating isolated doubled pawns on the c-file. Unleashing a positional threat, the bishop swings to the focal point, aiming to disrupt black's already compromised pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. Initiating a defensive maneuver to prevent immediate threats around the kingside, black fortifies their pawn structure by tucking the h-pawn back. This action, while seemingly passive, aims to create a more robust barrier against any potential pawn pushes or piece incursions from white's bishop on f4 and knight on g3, ultimately seeking to solidify the king's safety in the face of an open center and active white pieces. Unlocking the c-file for artillery deployment, this maneuver strategically prepares to contest central control, aiming to restrict black's pieces and prepare for a pawn storm on the kingside. Unleashing the king's potential with a pawn thrust forward creates immediate friction along the kingside, potentially opening lines for the monarch's eventual safety or launching an assault, while simultaneously accepting a slight positional risk by weakening the pawn shield and inviting counterplay. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing for potential expansion, this maneuver aims to solidify white's positional foothold while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting black's queenside weaknesses or supporting a future central advance. Seeking to unify her scattered queenside assets, black endeavors to reposition her queen to a more active diagonal and potentially spearhead a pawn advance along the d-file, aiming to disrupt white's currently imposing central control and open lines for counterplay. Reasserting central control and activating the rook from its defensive post, this move prepares to contest the open files and potentially exploit black's somewhat uncoordinated pieces. Shifting the king to the side offers protection and prepares for potential pawn pushes, but it also momentarily tucks it away from the center where white's rook is now a formidable presence. Securing the kingside pawn structure with a subtle advance, this move prevents any immediate black pawn incursions like g4 and shores up the king's shelter against potential future threats arising from the open files. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside suddenly introduces dynamic thrusts, potentially tearing open lines toward white's monarch, though the pawn's advance also leaves its own king somewhat exposed. Securing the monarch's escape route allows for bolder maneuvers on the queenside, potentially preparing a pawn storm or piece infiltration. Aiding the central pawn advance, black's advance of the pawn aims to disrupt white's bishop development and potentially prepare a queenside pawn push, creating complex pawn structures that could lead to exciting positional play. A bold reallocation of the rook, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially pressure the opponent's compromised kingside pawn structure. Shifting the queen to d5 now creates immediate pressure along the d-file and simultaneously prepares to challenge white's bishop on f4, aiming to disrupt its activity and potentially open lines for counterplay. Unlocking the kingside with a sudden pawn thrust, this push aims to disrupt black's well-entrenched defenders and open avenues for attacking the beleaguered monarch. The knight's charge to e3 suddenly injects a potent tactical jolt, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed white king and disrupt white's coordination. This aggressive knight placement, supported by the queen, forces white to immediately reevaluate their king's safety and the potential for a swift mating attack. It's a bold maneuver that seeks to seize the initiative through direct confrontation, rather than patient positional maneuvering, creating immediate problems for white's defense. Executing the rook exchange now, a significant decision, opens up lines that have been tightly constrained. This maneuver seeks to simplify the position, potentially leading towards an endgame where the material advantage might be easier to convert. However, it also liberates black's central pawns, which could become a potent attacking force if white's king becomes exposed. The long-term implications of this simplification, especially concerning the remaining pawns and the exposed nature of black's king, will be crucial to monitor. The pawn's advance, unleashing a central storm, radically alters the battlefield's landscape by opening a crucial path for the rook and aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn shield. With the kingside now truly shattered, your rook effectively occupies a vital open file, poised to exploit black's exposed monarch and potential pawn weaknesses. A bold, albeit risky, attempt to reclaim some material, this queen's sortie immediately plunges into enemy territory, bypassing the immediate threat to the king and ignoring the precarious position of the pawns. The intention is clearly to disrupt white's already comfortable setup and create counterplay, but it exposes the queen to potential harassment and opens avenues for white's rooks to become more active on the king's side. This gambit sacrifices positional solidity for tactical aggression, a choice that could either salvage the game or hasten its demise depending on white's precise response. Unleashing a knight sacrifice to expose the black king presents a crucial turning point in this unbalanced position, aiming to exploit the king's precarious central placement for a decisive attack. A logical retreat to consolidate the king's position, acknowledging the exposed nature of the royal family on this open chessboard. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal fury, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed black king and dismantle the pawn structure protecting it, potentially creating devastating attacking lines. The king's exposed position on g7 suddenly becomes a major liability, inviting a decisive counterattack. Unleashing a pawn storm across the kingside, this aggressive advance immediately forces black's monarch into a precarious situation, demanding attention and disrupting any potential defensive structure. Allowing the opponent's pawn to march forward like this, instead of capturing it, feels like intentionally inviting complications, a gamble that exposes your monarch to even more danger than it already faces from that marauding rook and bishop battery. Unleashing a decisive check, the rook on f8 forcibly disrupts black's king's shelter, creating immediate and overwhelming pressure. The black king, now exposed and central, must seek sanctuary behind its remaining pawns, a precarious pursuit given the open avenues white's pieces are poised to exploit. The rook now ventures to the queenside, eyeing the undefended pawn and threatening to swing over and harass the king if it attempts to escape its current predicament. A surprising decision to venture the king towards the queenside, potentially seeking refuge or attempting to activate it in a rapidly simplifying position where the open files are already hotly contested.